Hi, welcome to our focus on contrastive rhetoric. So what is contrastive rhetoric? Contrastive rhetoric is analyzing how writing patterns are different from language to language or from culture to culture. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to tackle the story of how contrastive rhetoric came into being, how it connects with our field, TESOL, and you'll get a sense of some of the different kind of understandings of culture and of writing styles that we think about when we think about contrastive rhetoric. And I think that they will be very helpful to you as you are working with your future students who are English language learners. At the end of the lecture, we're going to put our toe in the water with contrastive rhetoric, and we're going to take a look at two specific writing styles that are prevalent when people are writing in Japanese. And they are Danraku and Kisho Tenketsu. So I'm going to first start out with a story. I love a good story, and this is certainly one of the best ones in our field. And it's so interesting that you might even think I'm making it up, but I'm not. Okay, so you have a handout to follow along, and it's a list of terms, more terms than I have up here on the board. I'm thinking that it would be very helpful to you, and I'm also going to make reference during the lecture to the image that's at the bottom of that handout. And so you want to have that either in a printout or on an iPad somewhere around that you can take a look at as we're moving along. So the first thing I have listed up here is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And I'm guessing that at some point in maybe an anthropology class or a cross-cultural communication class, something like that, you've been exposed to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so what I want to do is to kind of tell you the story of how this came into being, and then tell the story from then how it impacted our field so much. So starting with Sapir, in the 1920s, the 1930s, there was a professor at a university who was named Sapir, and he was in anthropology. And what he was really focused on were the connections between language and thought and how people communicate and their cultural experiences. So he was really interested in the impact between all of those. So he's at a university, he's kind of in the ivory tower, he's doing his thing, and that's Sapir. But here's the interesting part. So a fellow named Whorf, he loves linguistics, but he studies it in his free time. He's interested in his free time. His day job is he is a fire insurance salesman. So he sells insurance to businesses or to homeowners to cover their businesses in case there's a fire. And if there is a fire, he is the one to go back to the clients and get their story about what happened, right? What happened first, what happened second, that kind of thing. And so Whorf so he's got this day job where he's listening to people's stories about how fires started and how they played out and what they tried to do to stop them. And then he's got this interest in how language works. And what he started to notice over time is that people from different cultural backgrounds told stories in different ways. So when he went to get the story of a fire, if that person was from culture A, he began to realize that there were certain patterns to how they told that story about what happened. And if they were from culture B, there was a different pattern that often would appear. So he's thinking about all of this, and he knows it has something to do with language, and he reaches out to Professor Sapir, and they begin working together. And that is where the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis comes from. And you probably can already guess the direction that we're going with this. The hypothesis was that the language that someone speaks actually impacts how they experience the world. And how someone experiences the world also impacts the language that they use. And that all of this is in a cultural context. And so language and culture are shaping thought, and thought is vice versa, shaping language and culture. So all of these things are kind of swirling around. The example, the most prevalent example, it's complicated because a lot of people have disputed it, but the most prevalent example of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis you probably already experienced and didn't even realize it is in talking about people who are from places where it snows 10 months a year. How do they talk about snow? And so if you follow the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, then you would point out that in those places where the more snow there is, the longer, the more that is the cultural experience, the lived experience of people, the more words will be developed to describe snow. So for example, I grew up in northern Indiana where it was snowy about half the year. I'm exaggerating slightly, but really, there were entire weeks where we couldn't leave our house because we were snowed in. So we had words like slush, snow, sleet, more words. It's been a while since I've been there, but you get where I'm going. Skiffs of snow, so when there's just kind of a little bit blowing across the road, we call that skiffs of snow. So this is an example of the more your lived experience and your cultural experience involves snow, the more your language will rise up to kind of meet that experience and provide you a way to communicate it. And it's been pointed out, and again, this is very complicated. If you were to Google Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you would find a lot of people who've disputed these ideas, but I'm throwing them out to you just as a starting place, that in those places where there is no experience of snow, there very often was not traditionally a word for snow, any words at all. And so that's kind of a nice, clear, easy, compact understanding of what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is. And so when Sapir-Whorf created their hypothesis, most people believe that really they meant a very weak form of it. So the weak form is that language and culture help shape thought, and that thought helps shape language, thought helps shape compact culture. And so what you have is there's some connection, right? There's some connection, but it's not a controlling connection. It's not a really strong connection. The strong form is that if you speak a certain language, you will have these kinds of thoughts. If you have these kinds of thoughts, you will have this kind of culture. So there's almost like a lockstep connection between them. And there's no evidence that when Sapir-Whorf created their hypothesis that they meant anything other than the weak form. So just by us kind of embracing the weak form rather than strong form, we've just sidestepped a whole lot of complexities and problems with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this was in the 30s, the 40s, the early 40s that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was being created, and it was kind of out there, but it wasn't out there for people like us. It wasn't out there for those of us teaching English language learners. In fact, there was no us. And what do I mean by that? I certainly don't mean that there weren't international students at universities. I don't mean that there were people who spoke, say, Italian at home and English in their third grade classroom. Certainly that was happening, but we didn't recognize ourselves as a profession. There was no TESOL. So around, I'll put this date up here, around 1965, some interesting things started to happen. On the one hand, a group of people gathered in Texas in around about 1965, and they named their organization TESOL. So it was the first time that people said what we do by focusing our efforts on teaching non-native speakers of English to read, write, learn, succeed in an English-speaking environment, that is a profession. That is teaching English to speakers of other languages. So in 1965, this group was getting going, but it was really limited. It started out in Texas. I think the next meeting was in Chicago, but this was still a very limited group of people who were there. So 1965, you have a young professor at University of Southern California, Robert Kaplan. And Robert Kaplan was teaching writing, composition courses, and probably, here's the way I envision it, some Sunday night, as he was grading a stack of essays, this is before Canvas, so these were all handed to him, so he's got this stack of essays, and maybe he had assigned students to write, say, a persuasive essay. And yet again, on that Sunday night, he did not get the essays that he thought he was going to get, right? They looked different. But here's where something interesting happened. He noticed that the students who were all native Arabic readers and writers, their essays missed the mark in a certain way, which was different than, say, those who were all native readers and writers of Korean. Their essays missed the mark in a completely different way. So for the first time, someone noticed and carried out research and published a paper that specifically looked at those who are learning to read and write in English, and they are coming from a different language and culture, that there are certain patterns of thought that they are expressing in their writing. And so he was pulling back on exactly on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. He was pulling this in. Now, Kaplan presented this paper, and I've mentioned this before in the methods class. Kaplan presented this paper in the only place he really could, and that was the conference of composition, the composition conference, CCCC. And so it was where people who were supporting developing writers, this is where they gathered every year. So he presented that paper at that conference, and from what I've read, what happened was the people in that session, they truly recognized at that moment that their struggles in teaching and supporting non-native speakers of English was very different from those who were working on composition support for native English speakers. That actually these were obviously some overlapping affairs, but also very different issues that they were dealing with. And so it was Kaplan's talk at that conference that brought a whole lot of people from that conference to the TESOL conference the following year in 1966, 1967. Okay, and so here you actually have kind of the story of the beginning of our profession, and in part it goes back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so I think this is a really, it's kind of a key thing to understand, that this was part of the bedrock of at least where we started. Now, there's a lot of problems with Kaplan's ideas, okay? And in fact, if we go back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, if you know very much about history, either U.S. history or international history, the 30s and the 40s were dangerous times. They were times when there were beliefs that about which groups, which cultures, which languages with ethnicities were smarter than others. And there was very much this idea that that we could sort people by cultures, and that really key, that there were inferior cultures and languages, that we could somehow create this hierarchy of value. And so I mean, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, even though if we take it, just this idea of this connections, I think it's a really useful tool. It can easily tip over into dangerous territory. And there's a lot of people who really steer clear of contrastive rhetoric because of all of those problematic and often downright racist ideas that can come directly out of that kind of thinking. Kaplan didn't sidestep this. If you take a look at the image that's on the handout that goes along with this lecture, you will see that in his paper that he published and presented in 1965, 1966, he created this image of the way that he believed different cultures and languages thought and how they expressed that thought. And the thing I want you to notice is the way that he said English expresses thought. So the other ones all look like this, or like this, right? That kind of thing. And English is expressed just as a straightforward arrow. Now let's stop and think about that for a moment. What are the chances that all the other languages in the world look different than a straight arrow, but it just happens that the language that Robert Kaplan grew up speaking and thinks in is the one that is the straight arrow. So right there you can see it's problematic. In 1965, 1966, it wasn't seen as problematic, but now we clearly see it as problematic. Obviously, this is the way Robert Kaplan sees the world, right? He was expressing his own biased perspective about how English works. And let's just talk for a moment about how a 5-paragraph essay works, all right? So you were told at some point, maybe in 4th grade, maybe in 7th grade, maybe as a freshman at university, that when you write a 5-paragraph essay, in the introduction, in the thesis statement, you tell people what you're going to tell them in the essay. In the body, you tell them. And in the conclusion, you tell them what you told them. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Does that look like a straight arrow? Not to me, right? And so it's just one little thing for you to kind of hold up and remember that all of these ideas, although being useful tools, they're also highly problematic. And when we talk about contrastive rhetoric, even people within our field can kind of bristle because of all of this kind of problematic history. But I think there's something in this, and I have experienced it myself as a teacher of English language learners, especially with adults who have fully mastered reading and writing in their first language, and then I'm working with them to translate what they can do into English. It's especially with them that I have been able to see that there are clear patterns in the assumptions that people make about what's acceptable to do in writing and what isn't acceptable to do. So what are we to do, right? What are we to do when we've got this problematic history? I think the thing for us to embrace is what's called critical contrastive rhetoric. And Ryoko Kubota, who is kind of a superhero in our field, I love to read her writing. She's written at least one great paper on critical contrastive rhetoric. And one of the things that she suggests, and anything that has critical in front of it, this is going to be a part of it, that we don't try to cut up the world neat and tidy. We don't try to assign clear labels to different groups or a certain identity, a fixed identity to a certain group or a certain language or a certain culture or even a certain individual, but rather that we embrace this idea of fluidity. We embrace this idea that every culture, every language is going to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? And so as we move into reader-responsible and writer-responsible languages, as I'm moving on to now, one of the things that I'm going to try to do for you is to bring up some examples of, even though it looks like most of the time in English we do it this way, we do have some other examples, right? And so That is kind of a key move that we can make in framing all of this so that it's not as problematic and it is a useful tool for us and it doesn't limit our thinking.